So we continue with today's lesson, part 2, and we want to continue by looking at estimation of solid waste quantities. Now, it's unrealistic for us to think that a community could completely eliminate our waste generation or even recycle all of the waste. But the intention really is to minimize as much as possible, reduce that waste for final disposal as much as we can, and that really is what our objective is. So estimation of the waste quantities is important for us for management of this process. So waste characterization studies, they typically yield highly accurate information, that information that we need for management purposes. However, further estimation is needed to determine percentages of the material that different communities can expect to collect. So the information gathering process, the data gathering process, it can actually be quite intensive at times. So some of the factors which need to be considered in the estimation of quantities are as follows. 1, does the community have a public or private collection system? So public would be the ones, for example, carried out by the our municipal corporations or regional corporations, for example. That would be public. Private would be those collection systems owned by private companies who would be contracted by different organizations. Sometimes they may even be contracted by government agencies. So the figures would tend to be more readily available from a public collection system. So the second point then is, does the community have businesses or industries which use private collection? So here is where the challenge is. Where private collection occurs, we may have a challenge accessing the waste generation information that we're looking for. So that is really, between points 1 and 2, that's really the issue here. If it is that you're using public collection systems, data may be more readily available. If it's private collection, data may not be as easily available. Okay. Third point, are there large numbers of residents in your community who recycle their own waste? So where we have recycling of waste from residents, so that's like a source of waste generation, you find that there's a reduction in the waste generation that you would estimate, because the waste generation rates would be estimated from what is collected. So if you have recycling going on in your home, or recycling or reuse, you tend to reduce the rate at which you're producing waste. So you can expect a direct influence on your waste generation rates. Unfortunately, even that information as to what is going on within the home in terms of recycling and reuse activities, that information would not be available either. The other question you would have to ask is, are there laws that would impact volumes? For example, local laws in favor of recycling or reuse. This can also reduce waste generation estimates. So again, laws which would tend to influence people's behavior, because usually laws will, when properly enforced and monitored, would tend to be associated with some kind of penalty for breaching those laws. So that will tend to impact people's behavior. So that can influence our waste generation estimates as well. So quantity and general composition of the waste material generated, this is critical to the design and operation of any effective waste management system that you're trying to develop. So we need that information as to what volumes of waste are being generated and the rate, or how fast it's being generated. But we also need to know what is the composition of that waste. What is it made up of? Is it made up of organic waste? Is it rubbish? glass, plastics, etc. So we need that information. And reliable quantity and composition data, this is often difficult to obtain. And why? Because most measurements of the quantities collected, of the quantities are collected or disposed of. We tend to get this from the landfill, and then when this is deposited at the landfill, even that becomes a difficult job as well, because you have the commingling of all different types of waste together. So now you have the job of trying to separate them to estimate different components and quantities, etc. We're going to look briefly at just two estimated estimation methods, waste volume estimation methods. And the first one is identified as load count analysis. And what does this type of method record? It records, first of all, the number of individual loads, such as the trucks that would come into, let's say, the landfill, the numbers of trucks. Then it would then you would look at the volume of waste being deposited with each load. And as mentioned before, that's easy for you to figure out, because you wouldn't have the information as to what the weight of the truck would be when it's empty. Then if you weigh it, you would be able to determine what volume or weight that is that you have deposited. Then you would also look at the composition of each load. And remember, as I said, the composition would be the different types of waste components that would be associated with that particular load. So this is one of the ways in which you can estimate your waste generation rates using this kind of information. And of course, this would be recorded over time. The second method, the mass volume analysis, this is similar to the previous one that we just looked at, the load count analysis. However, there's the added feature that the actual weight of the load is recorded. If you recall, previously we were looking at number of load, volume of load, and composition under load count analysis. Here we're looking at all of those, but we're also including the weight of it. Alright, so those are two examples of how we can calculate quantities data for our information. Right, so we're looking at estimating future waste generation. So the two most important trends to investigate when we are looking at data in order to project into the future, we need to look at population and public policy changes. Because when we look at population and particularly public policy changes, these are things that influence the way people behave. So we would look firstly at population growth rates, sorry. And when we have population growth rate, it means that we can project what that population would be in 20-25 years. With that kind of information, it means then that you will have some idea. If you already have current waste generation rates, it means that you can determine, okay, in 25 years I need to have the capacity to manage X amount of waste, so I have to have the facilities in place. That kind of information would also influence the types of policies and programs that your governments would put in place as well. They may see the need for increasing the implementation of recycling and reuse programs. They may see the need for the implementation of incineration facilities, etc. So this is why we need data. This is why we need waste generation rates, so that we can plan for the future. Also, where you have legislatively mandated recycling and composting programs, these strategies, as mentioned before, can help reduce your waste volume significantly, because legislation compels you to behave in a certain way. Um, Caution is essential as well in sizing facilities such as a landfill or a waste recycling facility. You do not want to oversize your facility, because now you can create an economic problem now if you have an oversized facility where you will have resources laying idle. So you would have had all that input of finances up front, and then you have your resources laying idle. So you don't want that. So determination of what is required must be done very carefully, so that you can put in place only what is required. You don't want to overdo it. Their waste composition changes are also important. So the composition determines our waste management strategies. As I said, for example, if you notice a lot of plastics and an increasing amount of plastic components in your waste, you know that you would have to plan to have facilities for collection of plastics, recycling of plastics, etc. Here we're looking at a chart. What I really need you to pay attention to on this chart is really the trends of the lines. So the different colors represent the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development in various regions. The blue is in Europe, orange Asia Pacific, and green North America. And what we're looking at here is municipal waste generation in rich countries. So we're particularly interested in the trend. How is this changing over time? On the y-axis we have weight, kilograms per capita per year, and on the x-axis we have years from 1980 to 2030. And basically I just want you to note that we are seeing a continuous upward trend, just with a few dips in between, but the basic trend is continuous. And I'm sure you can recognize this is reason for concern, because if there's very little steadying out and it continues to increase, we can have an impending crisis on our hands globally here. Alright, because what we have is a trend towards increasing solid waste generation. So let's look briefly now at on-site handling of waste. So on-site handling would be the source of the generation. For example, your household. So handling and separation of waste, this is a critical step in the management of residential solid waste. What systems do we have in place? On-site handling refers to the activities that are associated with the handling of the solid waste until they are placed into containers which are used for their storage before collection. So in other words, how are you handling the waste? What are you doing with the waste before you put it in those bins or bags and put them out for collection by the garbage truck? So let's look at what happens with the domestic solid waste. So typically the solid waste is typically accumulated at several locations in and around low and medium rise residential dwellings. So that's where you have apartment buildings, etc. Some just a few floors, and others medium rise. And what you would place your waste in larger containers to wait for removal by the solid waste collection agency or the garbage truck that comes around. So there would be some kind of larger container that would be on the outside of the building, somewhere around the corner, the back, etc. Alright. Also related to the domestic generation, other options would be where you have curbside collection, and this is used where the resident is responsible for placing the loaded larger storage container at the curb. So the curb meaning you place it outside that house, outside your house, at that point where the garbage truck can easily pull over, collect your container, empty it into the garbage truck, and they would replace the container for you. And now usually it is your responsibility to remove the container and take it back inside. Okay, so it's really about curbside collection, really is about the process of you being responsible for putting out the garbage. And if you did that in a container, it's your responsibility to return the container to your house. Here is an example of some of the different types of containers that may be used for storage before collection. So we have, many of you might be familiar with the dumpster scenario. These would be used in multi-residential buildings. Sometimes you will even find them strategically placed in communities where the garbage truck may not necessarily be able to access every individual house in the community. So there would be community dumpsters. Also, we have, these are examples of containers that can be put out onto the outside of your house on the street corner there for collection by garbage trucks. So these normally, as you can see the wheels on them, they can be put out and then returned to your house to be filled again. Alright, and then of course these are just examples of different types of bins that you can use throughout your house or your office, etc. Then we have commercial and industrial solid waste handling. How do we handle that? So in most office, commercial and industrial buildings, solid waste are collected in relatively large containers mounted on rollers. So oftentimes you find there would be like a basement storage where the waste would be put into that basement storage, and since they're on wheels, they can now transport that. It's now mobile. So once the containers are filled, they would be removed by means of a service elevator if you need to change levels, or it would be taken outside now and emptied into a larger storage container. Some of those larger storage containers may be designed with compactors on it. So the compactors would be like that piece of equipment where it will crush the waste and compact it into less volume. So the stationary compactors will compress the material into bales, thereby reducing the volume and making it easier to store. And then of course sometimes other options in these kinds of settings, there may also be on-site incinerators where the waste can be burnt and disposed of easily. Okay, if there is no incinerator, the compacted waste would be collected by a collection agency to be disposed of as well. Okay, we're going to discuss briefly on-site storage of solid waste. So what are some of the factors that would influence the type of storage containers that we would choose? We're going to look briefly at each of these, the effects of the nature of the waste components on your choice, the type of container, the location, where do we put it, and we're also going to be looking at public health and aesthetic concerns. So let's look at the effects of storage on waste components. So the first point we want to look at is microbiological decomposition. So where we have food and other organic waste we place in on-site storage containers, we need to be reminded this type of waste would almost immediately start to decompose. And when it decomposes, it results in the growth of bacteria and fungi. So I just want to draw your attention to this little diagram here. So we have our so the type of waste we're talking about would be organic waste, so such as you would find in a compost pile. When this begins to break down, remember what you will what would be released would be water, carbon dioxide, and heat. So if you do not have an appropriate type container to contain this type of material, because as I said, remember, you're releasing water, carbon dioxide, and heat, you're going to have problems on your hand. So for example, if you choose to put that in a metal storage there are going to be leaks, it's going to be rusting, all kinds of things going to happen, and that would not be very sanitary. Then we also have concerns with regards to absorption of fluids. So because the components that comprise solid waste have different initial moisture contents, re-equilibrium takes place as the waste are stored on site in the container. What do we mean by this? Where you have different types of waste mixing together. For example, you will have paper absorbing the moisture from food waste and garden trimmings. So now you have a mixing, a commingling of your waste as a result of absorption of fluids. Other concerns would be contamination of waste components. So so this has a serious effect on the on-site storage process. For where you have major waste components that may be contaminated by small amounts of waste such as motor oils, chemicals from household cleaners, paints, etc. This now makes any potential for recycling very difficult, because recycling will require the separation of waste. So if you have your waste now contaminated by these chemicals, etc., or even from the absorption of fluids, as we mentioned, it reduces your opportunity for recycling of waste. So with regards to storage, if you know recycling is recycling or reuse is your intention, you would need to plan your storage in such a way that you need to separate your waste. So you'll have different bins, one bin for glass, one bin for containers, one bin for paper, etc., in order to minimize this type of cross-contamination. Alright, types of containers. So the type and capacity of the containers used will depend on the following: the characteristics and the type of the waste to be collected, as I mentioned before. If you know it's waste that is going to be decomposing and producing all kinds of substances, you need to choose an appropriate container. You would also look at the type of the collection system in use. For example, is it a manual system or a mechanical system? So a manual system will be a system where the truck comes by to collect your garbage, and you have you have the helpers, the guys who would be on the truck. They will come down, take the container and manually empty it into the truck, right? Then you also have the mechanical system, where you would see the truck would actually come by and it will have these mechanical arms that will connect to the storage container that you have, and those mechanical arms would lift and empty into the truck and then replace the container. So that means then that your containers must be designed in such a way that it can facilitate that mechanical process. You also look at types of containers with regards to the collection frequency. So for example, if collection is not done too often, you need to determine, alright, what size containers do I need, how often do I put them out, etc. And then you also have to consider space availability for the placement of the containers. You have to look around at your surroundings. So space availability is not only a matter of whether the container can fit there, but it also is a matter of where I put it. Can the garbage truck access it? Alright, so that is really what we would be concerned about. Right, so getting back to the location of the container. So this depends on the type of dwelling or commercial or industrial facility. Do you have available space? And that particular space that you're looking at, is it accessible to the collection vehicle? So for example, in roads, residential dwellings, between collections, your containers used in low rise, so that would be like single detached buildings, homes, Some of the options you have for placement would be at the sides of the house. So this is just storage location where your garbage would be stored before you put it out on the curbside. So it could be the side or the rear of your house. In places where you have alleyways, it could be stored there. It could be in or next to your garage or carport, and where some common location is specifically designated for that purpose. So for example, as I said, for some communities, dumpsters would have to be strategically placed, so that's what we're referring to. For commercial and industrial facilities, placement depends on the location of the space available, as mentioned, and the service access conditions. So in other words, the collection trucks need to be able to have access to where the storage bins are. So these things have to be carefully thought out. Alright, it's not only a matter of do I have space to place my bins or my storage containers, but if the collection trucks need to come get the container because it's so large that you are not able to put it out, because for commercial and industrial facilities the containers would be large. So it means then that it's necessary that it is in a place where the collection trucks can access them. Then also related to container types, we have our public health consideration. So residential solid wastes have a significant public health and aesthetic impact, right? The public health concerns are primarily associated with the infestation of areas used for storage of solid waste, and that's where they would attract vermin, pests, insects, etc. And the proliferation of these types of organisms can lead to disease. So we would require proper sanitation, and that involves the use of containers with tight lids to cover the waste. There must be periodic washing of the containers as well as the storage area itself. So you have to wash down not only containers but the storage area. And then you would also have to have periodic removal of biodegradable materials, which we know would, once, especially if it's in warm climates, that is fast decomposition. And then there is also the aesthetics, the look of the environment. So you have to consider the containers with regards to that as well. So these considerations are related to the production of odors and unsightly conditions that can develop when adequate attention is not given to maintenance of the sanitary conditions. So this photo below here actually gives us an idea of what we're talking about. This is not only a public health issue, it's very unsightly. So then you also have issues of odors associated with that. So odors would normally be controlled through the use of tight lids. Again, here we're talking about tight lids and the maintenance of a reasonable collection frequency. So you don't want to have a piling up of garbage. As sometimes even here in Trinidad you find that might happen at certain times of the year, if it's a long weekend, etc. Alright, and if odors persist, the content of the container, you could spray it, so you can have masking deodorant to mask the unpleasant odor, at least as a temporary measure. So this brings us to the end of today's lesson. I would like to ask you now to please proceed to the activity for this week. Thank you.